All right, I think we are ready to roll. Charles already has a cold coffee in his hand, so I know we're all set here.
Let's
So
do it.
welcome, welcome everyone to the webinar here about Russia-Ukraine conflict and how that impacts the cyber world and what's going on. Really looking forward to a great conversation here. I'm honored to be accompanied with Charles Carmakal, SVP and CTO at Mandiant. And it's certainly a guy that's seen an attack or two in his life. Mandiant have certainly done quite a lot of work in the incident response space and seen some pretty interesting stuff. So let me pass it over to you for any word on yourself, Charles, before we get going.
Yeah, Ofer, first of all, thanks a lot for the invitation. It's good to chat with you and excited about the discussion today. There's a lot going on and happy to share what are we actually seeing today and separate some of the fact and fiction and maybe some of the hype that exists out there.
Awesome. Awesome. So I'm Ofer Israeli. I'm the founder and CEO of Illusive. We deeply care about high impact attacks. And certainly this is a time where high impact attacks are at stake. And so certainly an interesting period for us. We all know it's been rough days these last few weeks, and in preparation, for months ahead of that. And so certainly turbulent times from all of the different aspects. And certainly there's a lot to be said about this war, which we won't get into, but what we will try to cover is really the cyber elements and what is going on, what should we be preparing for, what are we thinking about, and how best do we ensure that we keep our safety throughout this thing for as long as it lasts and beyond that. So again, Charles, thanks for joining us. Maybe to kick things off, could you give us a bit of the lay of the land? What are you seeing out there? What's happening and what's not happening?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So let me start with sharing what we started seeing last year. So in 2021, we saw a number of attacks against mostly government entities and some commercial entities that either have access to the networks or data of certain governments. And we saw Russian attacks against those government entities. And most of those government entities were affiliated or members of NATO, but not all of them were. And so we were, for example, some of the ministries of foreign affairs were targeted by the Russian government. And it was mostly espionage in nature. It was data. We think that they were looking for data that was of strategic interest to the Russian government. So we saw a lot of that in 2021. In early 2022, we saw the continuation of espionage-related activities, but we also started seeing destructive attacks occur in Ukraine. So we saw some malware wiper-related activity in early 2022, and then we also saw a lot of that continue throughout the weeks and the months. When we look at where we're seeing the majority of the attacks today from the Russian government, they're really centered in Ukraine. And there are actually a lot of attacks that are happening, mostly for government entities as well as commercial organizations that provide some level of critical infrastructure to the country, whether it's from a communications perspective or they provide IT support to the government. And so, unfortunately, things are pretty tough out there. We also saw some interesting hybrid attacks. And so, in parallel with the physical invasion of Ukraine, we saw a number of attacks against communications infrastructure in Ukraine. So it's pretty wild to see what's going on out there. I think when we look at the rest of the world and maybe just focus on the Western world, there's been a lot of conversation around destructive attacks related to maybe banking organizations or energy organizations or other critical infrastructure in the Western world. The good news is we haven't seen anything very destructive or disruptive today. But what we are seeing is a lot of poking and prodding, a lot of scanning by threat actors that we know are affiliated with the Russian government. And a lot of the attacks are kind of noisy and somewhat basic right now. And I think there's a deliberate reason for why we're seeing attacks like what we're seeing today. Because I'll start by saying it's pretty uncharacteristic for Russian government threat actors to conduct intrusion activities or scanning that's really loud and noisy, or at least that's what we perceive to be the case. But when you have loud and noisy scanning, a lot of times organizations, they look at that and they think, well, can't possibly be the Russian government, because who's going to try to log into systems using, the username of administrator and the password of password, or Spring 2022 and variations like that. But I do believe that the Russian government at times operates in a way where they're noisy because people that see them won't think that it actually is them. And so that's kind of what we're seeing today. What we're not seeing is really destructive attacks or really sophisticated attacks against a large number of organizations in the United States. But we're all anticipating that'll happen at some point in time. I think there's probably some reason why it's not happening. And I think part of it is, I think Russia is, first of all, they're very isolated today. And I think they are very concerned about what actions will they take in cyberspace that might lead to a kinetic consequence. And everybody's thinking about Article 5, and at what point in time does a cyber attack lead to a physical response? And so it's hard to tell when they're going to actually do something. I think we're all anticipating there will be something. There's a general methodology and approach of a kind of a tit for tat methodology out there. So when their banking sector is impacted, they want to go after other people's banking sectors. And so there's a perception or a belief that our banking infrastructure may be targeted to some extent. But we're not really seeing really destructive attacks right now, with the exception of pretty noisy scanning. And that's a good thing. And it might change down the road, but so far we haven't really seen anything, at least that we have directly attributed to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Now, one additional point that I would just add is there's a lot of just ransomware and multifaceted extortion that happens all the time. There's a lot of different victims out there. It's possible that the Russian government is allowing some of this to happen, but we haven't seen any evidence of them directing threat actors, criminal operations to hitting particular organizations. It's possible it's happening, but again, we just haven't seen the evidence of that.
Yeah, and I think that last point is actually quite interesting when there's a lot of, there's a big question mark around, with all of the financial consequences that Russia's going through now and will be going through for a period here. Do they take a page out of the North Korean book and start to utilize ransomware more strategically for actually getting funds into the government? I mean, we know it's always been somewhat of a blended line in Russia, but that at some point could convert from letting things happen to utilizing it in order to fund some of the things they need to see.
It's an interesting point that you bring up. And so, yes, the North Korean government absolutely leverages, criminals to conduct financially motivated intrusions that benefit the country. And, you see them stealing or attempting to steal sometimes billions of dollars, which I always kind of find a little interesting. If you're going to hack into a bank, I don't know that I would try to steal $1 billion because it raises some red flags. Maybe do smaller amounts of money, but do it over time. But it's possible now that with Russia becoming isolated from the rest of the world, perhaps at some point in time, maybe they end up doing that. But I want to point out what we have seen over the last several years, and we have firsthand evidence of this, is there are some intrusions that the Russian government conducts where it's very clear to us that it was an operation conducted by the government, typically an intelligence organization, that was done for some political reason or because maybe there's some embarrassment. So think back to 2016, and I'm not going to talk about the elections, but I'll talk about the allegations of Russian athletes using performance enhancement drugs, and the Russian government allegedly knowing about this. And that became a pretty big controversy. And so the Russian government wanted to prove to the rest of the world that everybody else uses performance enhancement drugs. And so they hacked into a number of the anti-doping agencies, and they stole drug tests and they published it on the internet. But what's not really talked about often is that there was an element of extortion that played out. And in today's day and age, we would call that ransomware. It's not ransomware. There's no encryptors that were deployed. But what it was an attempt to look like it was a criminal operation with what was clear to us at the time was obvious fake extortion demands, because there was no real easy way to pay the threat actors. But what I anticipate seeing in the future is a continuation of some of the false flag operations that the Russian government tends to use, where they might not want to make it look like it's a government operation, but make it look like it's a criminal operation leverage some element of extortion, perhaps even ransomware, just so it looks like it's not them, and they could safely distance themselves from the activity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that's exactly what we saw. So in the infamous NotPetya attack, right, where it's supposed to be pay this ransom, but you can't really pay it, or
Exactly.
it's cumbersome to pay it, and evidently behind it is a state sponsor, not just some criminal group.
That's right. Yeah.
So tying it back to Ukraine itself, and you mentioned governmental entities and some critical infrastructure that has been hit. There's obviously a heightened level of activity, and I know your teams are around the clock on this stuff and are seeing quite a lot, and some of which you can probably address and some of which you cannot. Are there particular instances where you can shed some light on, give us a flavor of what's going on?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of government targeting in Ukraine right now. There's also commercial entity targeting, and there's a few reasons why we're doing this work, or why we're doing this response work. Well, first of all, we've got a team of people that are in Ukraine that are very loyal to their countries, that want to defend their nation. And so there's a lot of emotion and energy behind just helping the people out there and just helping defend the country. There's a secondary benefit as well. We recognize that a lot of the intrusion activity that occurs out there will likely be seen in other parts of the world. And so there's a strategic benefit in getting access to that information, in addition, obviously, to the patriotic nature of the people that are out there. A lot of the attacks today, it's honestly, it looks and feels like a lot of the other attacks that we see kind of every day, in terms of how threat actors are getting into organizations, how they're escalating privileges, how they're moving around. I think the end goal is different. And so the end goal at a lot of these victims is somewhat of a destructive capability, because the Russian government's objective is not to necessarily steal money from these organizations or extort them. It's to cause chaos, it's to cause disruption, it's to cause, to shut off communications. And so it's kind of that end stage of the operation that seems to be a little bit different. And so we're seeing, the use of a variety of different wipers, and we've seen so many different wipers that have been used out in Ukraine. That's probably one of the key differences. When I take a step back and not, and you can maybe just share a data point that's not necessarily specific to Russia, Ukraine, but just general or across the world, based on our caseload data, the number one way of getting into an organization initially isn't through email-based phishing anymore. Based on our caseload data, we're seeing it's really through the exploitation of vulnerabilities and misconfigurations. And so that's, it's been interesting to see the shift. And I think there's probably a few reasons for those shifts. I mean, I think number one, we're just getting better as companies in blocking malicious emails that have malicious payloads and attachments or links to websites. I think just in general, we're getting better. We're not saying that it's stopped altogether. Of course, that's still a common way in, but we're just seeing more and more focus on vulnerabilities of external facing infrastructure, and that's just accounting for a lot of the intrusions. And another interesting way that threat actors are getting in is just by abusing weak passwords or easily guessable passwords or commonly reused passwords. We all talk about the concept of using password managers and using different passwords across every website and every resource that we have access to. And the benefit of that is, if one company gets hacked and credentials are downloaded and password hashes are cracked, those threat actors will probably try to reuse those passwords across different resources. So one common methodology that we see is, you have an e-commerce site, or let's just say it's like some tech portal that gets hacked. Threat actors will download all the usernames and password hashes. They'll use GPUs to crack as many passwords as they possibly can. They'll try to then log in using those passwords to, say, GitHub instances or GitLab instances or other source code repositories. And they'll just hunt for secrets there, whether it's API keys or other usernames and passwords. And then they'll attempt to reuse those passwords against corporate infrastructure. Your question might be, well, what about multi-factor authentication? So sometimes we don't see multi-factor authentication protecting those resources. Other times we do see multi-factor authentication protecting it, but insecure protections or MFA protections are put into place. So think about situations where you could do MFA pushes, where you get a pop-up, where the user gets a pop-up on their phone and they have to click yes to accept or no to decline. Sometimes we have to log into our applications so often, and sometimes there's an automatic re-login that you just get kind of conditioned to hit the accept button on your phone because you think it's actually your own device or app, a process that's re-authenticating. But sometimes people just get annoyed when they see that and they just blindly say, click the accept key, button, or maybe they're just on the move and they accidentally hit the button. And we know that there are a number of threat actors, whether it's government affiliated threat actors. So we've seen a group that we call UNC2452, the folks behind the SolarWinds attack. We see them abusing this technique where they basically spam MFA pushes until somebody clicks the accept button. And then we've seen a group of kids called Lapsus. You leverage this technique. They'll also use the telephone call solution where you get a phone call and you have to hit the one key or the pound key or whatever. And when you do that at 2 o'clock in the morning and you do it enough times, somebody's going to hit a bunch of buttons thinking that they're unsubscribing or getting added to the do not call list. So those are techniques that people use to get in nowadays. So again, to recap, we see a lot of misconfigurations and exploitation of vulnerabilities, and then just the abuse of passwords.
Yeah, interesting. You say it makes a lot of sense, by the way, because we all know as the security industry, we've been struggling with both for quite a while. Actually curious if we're on the tools and tactics. It's something that we've seen a lot of over the years is not only on the getting in, but how an attacker actually privilege escalates and moves laterally across the environment. And we've seen the weakest link being just the access to secrets, right? Like there are domain admin credentials in places where organizations don't know because they're being cached somewhere or misappropriately stored, or there's excessive privileges of various accounts that attackers are finding and exploiting and so on and so forth. And that poses obviously a very significant risk. We've seen that play a tremendous role in the ransomware attacks and the ransomware world, and it's become their bread and butter. I'm curious when you think about Russian, state-sponsored activities, sophisticated threat actors in general, and then in particular as pertains to what you're seeing in Ukraine, do you see them following that same path? Is it like I land, I find now my access to this privileged identity because I can, and then I use that to move across the environment? Is that still the pattern?
Yeah. So in general, most threat actors leverage a path of least resistance to get into the organizations and to escalate privileges. So they bring their A game when they need to, but they'll start off with maybe their C game or their D game, depending on how hard the target is to get into. A lot of times now we're seeing kind of the C game or the D game being employed at certain organizations, just because it's really easy to get in. It's easy to escalate privileges. Sometimes, you see the threat actors are incredibly noisy and they don't care because the objective is to cause chaos and it's to disrupt organizations. And so it doesn't matter how noisy they are. You see for example, you see the use of tools like Bloodhound, which are good pen testing tools and good tools for security administrators, but a lot of threat actors use that, and it's very noisy. It just could generate a lot of alerting if you're monitoring for that type of activity. But in general, you see a lot of just basic privilege escalation on systems where you need to get local admin rights. Once you get local admin rights to a machine, you use tools to get domain credentials. It may not be domain admin credentials, it might just be domain user credentials. And then once you have domain user, or maybe if you have domain user credentials, what you kind of do is you kind of look across the enterprise and figure out what other systems do you have admin rights to. And then you kind of just run this like continuous playbook of downloading hashes from the system, trying to download secrets from memory, from LSAS, wherever you could get it, doing things like Kerber roasting, looking for those credentials, and then trying to crack the ones that you can, and then you just kind of continue the process until you escalate it, till you get to basically server admin rights, to the point where maybe you get access to an OU that is ultimately an administrator on a domain controller or a system that has a lot of authentications. And then you just grab credentials or hashes from those machines. And by the way, you don't actually need to get every single username and password hash out there. One of the techniques that, and again, I'm going to shift away a little bit from the Russian advanced attacks and what we're seeing in Ukraine, which by the way, they're not necessarily all that advanced in Ukraine from an attack perspective. They're just doing what, the threat actors do what they need to get in. But one thing that we're seeing with some of these kids that are hacking, so I'll use Lapsus again. sometimes they don't even have domain admin rights. They're just logging into systems with credentials, and they're downloading content that that user has legitimate rights to download. So we see them logging into like GitHubs or Perforce or other source code repositories, and they just vacuum out as much data as they possibly can. And then they package it up and they throw it on an AWS S3 bucket, or they create a torrent link, and then they just advertise it on Telegram or however they want to communicate it out. So you don't necessarily need domain admin rights to cause a lot of chaos to a victim organization.
Yeah, no, for sure. Something we see quite commonly is, you might have a DBA that has access to a database with sensitive data. That DBA might be in a separate role now, but how do you know if that access doesn't exist in the database anymore? And if that DBA is stored credentials on their machine to that database, then
Sure, yeah.
Although they might be in a separate role now, attacker lands on that machine, immediately gets access to what was once owned by that person. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So it seems like they're following the same pattern. I think, you hit the nail on its head. It's the path of least resistance, right? It's human beings on the other side. And if so long as it's easy for them to do, and so long as they can get credentials and they can get that stuff, of course they're going to do it, because why work hard and expose some significant capabilities and maybe novel capabilities when you can do it in a much easier and cost-effective manner. So it makes a lot of sense. So back to Ukraine for a second. One of the things I think we've all seen is Ukraine itself, and with the help with some of the allies and some of the Western countries as well, I think they've done some pretty neat stuff in terms of preparation for the attacks themselves. And we've seen things like them opening up the telcos to open up service operation from any telco. So I might be a subscriber of telco X, but I can get service from others in case X is disrupted. And we've seen things like the train management systems, which work out of a remote site now that moves constantly and it's kind of harder to track and such. So they prepared for this thing, and they obviously took it seriously, rightfully so. And from an operational standpoint, did some push the envelope a little in order to ensure that they would be able to sustain and remain resilient against some of these attacks. Is there how much of a role do you think that plays in their resilience? And is there anything we should learn from what they're doing and kind of incorporate it into what we're doing in the Western countries?
Yeah. So I just want to echo, like, these folks are incredibly resilient, and it's very humbling working with folks out there. And I'll tell you, we get some pretty interesting text messages from people there where, for example, we asked them if they could get us access to some data. Their response is, the person that has the ability to get access to that data is in a bomb shelter. He'll be there for the next 24 hours and we'll get you the data in about 36 hours or so. So it's honestly, it's surreal getting text messages like that. We're interacting with somebody that's in a building that's, being shelled and, being shot at, and they've got to evacuate the building, and we get messages saying, hey, well, we'll get to that action item, but we're physically being attacked right now. So, honestly, it's incredible. And just look at the the patriotism, the loyalty to of those people, and just the resilience. It really is incredible. So, in terms of learnings, look, the learnings of the threats are very important, because again, some iteration of that will carry out to other parts of the world. It may not be the exact tooling, it may not be the exact infrastructure that's used, but the overall methodology and the approach will be reused in other parts of the world. And so we're definitely learning a lot about that. There's other things that might feel a little bit unique to Ukraine, or unique to a country that's currently in a battle or in a war. But I'll raise a few things, and maybe it'll give some folks some ideas of things to kind of think about from a threat modeling perspective. So something that we've had to really think about is, how do we secure assets that might not be physically secure? So think about an organization that might have physical servers in lots of different parts of the world. We're dealing with situations where some of our clients have buildings that have been taken over by Russian troops. And so the assets that are hosted in those buildings are considered to be untrusted or potentially compromised. And so as you think about, like, what do you do, and how do you protect those assets, and how do you protect the data that's on them when you have no no physical control over those resources anymore. And so just think about like global organizations, for example, that might do business in Russia today, or other parts of the world that are considered to be potentially hostile. How do you wipe machines, remotely wipe machines from the network? How do you handle certain privacy aspects of systems and resources and processes that might exist in other parts of the world that are considered to be more risky? Then how do you do that in a way that's diplomatic and not not considered to be racially profiling or doing something that might be politically insensitive? So it creates a whole lot of challenges for organizations that are doing things in other parts of the world. And so we're now thinking about these things. So I don't have the greatest answer for what exactly should we all be doing, but I think we should be thinking about it, figuring out whether or not that exists in our risk model, and then addressing it as we can.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. In respect to that, with everything going on there, and obviously a lot of attention is focused on Russia, Ukraine, rightfully so. It kind of potentially provides opportunities for some other threat actors, right? And when we think about China and North Korea and Iran, and the common suspects, and maybe beyond that, are you seeing any changes in terms of activities from those countries? Are there things we should be aware of?
Yeah, so I am seeing some continued activity from certain groups in China, seeing some new activity from North Korean threat actors. For whatever reason, I'm not really seeing a whole lot of change or a lot of new activity from Iranian operators. And maybe it's happening, I'm just not seeing it. But I fully appreciate the fact that everybody's so focused on the Russia-Ukraine conflict right now that I have no doubt that there are attacks that we're just not seeing because we're not focused on it right now. And there are certainly times of the year and over the past few years where I felt that's the case. I actually think back to the midterm elections. At the time, we were so focused on, we were focused on a lot of things, but there was an acute threat to healthcare organizations, and so a lot of security and technology companies were focused on the destruction and disruption to hospitals that we kind of forgot that there is an election that was going on, and we did see some intrusion activity, that were election related or potentially election related, nothing too serious. But it definitely makes us wonder, are there things that are happening that we just don't notice because we're so laser focused on a finite set of threats? And there's only so many security professionals out there. There's only so many things that you can look at. So yeah, I am pretty sure there are things that are happening today that we're just not seeing. And we might notice it 6 months from now and trace back and say, oh shit, that happened 6 months ago. And sorry for the profanity. I just realized I used the S word.
Well, in these troubling times, that won't be our biggest concern. So I think we'll live with that. I was at FSI Zach 2-3 weeks ago and met up with a lot of our customers. And a common theme that I heard from everybody is a lot of CISOs, they have their teams at kind of full capacity, really preparing for the worst to come. And they're not seeing it yet, right? So they're not seeing the attacks themselves. And then it kind of gets you also into this sort of challenging situation of how long can you keep a team kind of living by the thought that it might happen tomorrow and tomorrow never comes. And at some point, things start to give. And how do you prepare for that? And certainly I found it as a very interesting topic that was brought up by quite a few. From your clients and what you're seeing in North America and other Western countries, are you exhibiting some of the same? Do you have any thoughts on how we should be thinking about it from a security organization perspective and just finding that balance?
Yep. Yeah. It's definitely an interesting question. It's kind of an interesting, kind of an emotional thought process that many of us go through. We spend so long preparing for something, but if that thing doesn't actually play out, then do you feel like you've wasted your time? And you bring up a few good points. People, security professionals, they're fatigued. I mean, there's been problem after problem after problem for so many months now that you could only keep this up for so long. And then when you don't see the threats actually, come to fruition, it makes you think, hey, you might have wasted your time. But let me just be very clear. The fact that we haven't seen destructive attacks against a broad number of organizations in the United States and other parts of the world, of course, excluding Ukraine, which we have seen. But the fact that we're not seeing massive destructive attacks across the world, it's a very, very good thing. So we should all be thankful that that's the reality of what's happening right now. But at some point in time, look, I do think it's very very realistic that we will see some attacks. Hard to say whether or not the biggest banks in the world are going to be the ones that end up getting targeted. Those, the biggest banks in the world are also the ones that tend to have the most defenses because they're spending the most amount of money on technologies and people and processes. It could be smaller organizations. Again, everybody's worried about what cyber attack would lead to a physical consequence. And so would it be perceived to be a minor threat to the United States if a regional bank was impacted? Because it sends a message, but at the same time, it maybe doesn't necessarily escalate things to a point of actual retaliation, from a cyber or from a physical perspective. So look, I would just say, look, we got to continue to stay focused on this problem because we strongly anticipate that something will happen. When you have the president of the United States that addresses the nation and says something's going to happen, the presidents don't give that guidance based on very loose and light intelligence. They tend to make addresses to the nation based on much more concrete information. Now, they may not have concrete information specifically as to exactly which organization might be targeted, but there's enough knowledge of the desire by the Russian government to conduct attacks that we all have to kind of think about it and defend ourselves as best as we can. So let's feel fortunate that really bad things haven't happened, but let's continue to stay calculated, measured, and let's prepare where we can.
Yeah, absolutely right. And yeah, you're absolutely right. Let's not lose sight of the fact we've had good fortune in the meantime. Part of that is preparedness, and part of that is good fortune, and we should praise that and continue on that trajectory, obviously, as much as possible. So for everybody in the crowd, we have a couple questions here that came in. If there are any additional questions, feel free to pop them in the Q&A box as we start to wrap up our time here. And Charles, let me ask you, first question I have here is any advice for what security teams defending global companies could be prioritizing to protect against what's been seen in Ukraine recently? And in particular, are there any strategies and technologies and things we should bring into the companies?
Yeah, I don't want to feel like I'm giving vanilla advice, but one of the most important things I think are important for companies is to conduct a red team exercise and just test your defenses. Figure out, are there internet exposed systems that are vulnerable to known or easy to exploit vulnerabilities? Can users be phished? Can users be socially engineered over the telephone? Which, by the way, is a technique that we see a number of threat actors leveraging today. And try, get your testers to try to get as far into the network and to critical systems and data as they possibly can, without creating these arbitrary restrictions on the time in which they can conduct their testing and whether or not they could actually exploit vulnerabilities and whether or not they could, socially engineer people, because those are the techniques that the real world adversaries are using. And what I like about red team exercises is it gives you concrete information as to what security vulnerabilities and weaknesses are there. And then you could build a roadmap to fix things based on that. And don't feel bad if the red teamers are able to break in. I mean, just feel good that it was the good guys that broke in as opposed to the bad guys. But a lot of the techniques that red teamers would use, they are told not to do it because there's a perception that it might be insecure, or there's change control windows that organizations want to adhere to. So try to remove the restrictions from the red teamers. The second thing I'd encourage organizations to do is conduct incident response tabletop exercises or crisis response exercises with your executive team and pull in your board where you think it's possible, and try to understand what are board responsibilities in the event of a major event versus what are management responsibilities. When does the board want to be involved in decisioning? When do they just want to be informed about an event or about a major component of an event? And so that's an important thing to do. And I think it's important because what usually happens is a lot of business leaders recognize that there is a responsibility and an expectation from them that they didn't know existed before the tabletop exercise. A lot of times business leaders think that the IT team and the security team is solely responsible for any kind of major crisis. But if your network is down, if you can't send emails, if you can't conduct business operations, the business leaders have to deal with a lot of the outcome of that. Those are the two things I'd recommend.
Yeah, no, both very good pieces of advice. And if I'd follow on with a couple of things from my side as well, then
Sure.
first, in regards to what you said on red team, I totally support that and see the same. Like red teams will give you an indication of what's actually possible inside your environment, and they're a good indication of not something theoretical, but something very practical. Like this is here, we've just seen this happen. Fortunately, it was an ethical one and not a threat actor, but it actually works in our environment. The thing I see organizations sometimes not leverage everything they can from a red team, and I would encourage all organizations to do, is once you have those set of findings, how do you extract the underlying reason, right? What's the why behind it? So as we know, if a red team took a certain path, they might have seen certain things on that path. There's likely another 100 paths available. And if we're able to take the data that was provided in the red team and extract from it, what do we need to do to fix it more strategically and broadly? I think that's the huge opportunity to really get more resilient. The second thing, which is related to it, is do your basics, right? There's a lot, and that's not, I say it as if it's easy. It's not easy, and it really is hard. And you mentioned attackers are exploiting vulnerabilities. Hey, we've been living with this problem a long time, and it's hard. It's hard to go out and patch systems. It's hard to close everything from all the different directions, and it can impact the business, as we know. But it's so important because here we see this is how attackers are getting in. We see identity risk left behind. Attackers are exploiting it for a very long time. It's hard to fix the problems, hard to find them and fix them, but that's what they're utilizing. And so some of it is, I think, also making sure that while there's new shiny things we can run after, how do we just ensure we have our basics and fundamentals really, really well covered? And that'll probably fix 95% of the problem. Then we need to deal with the top 5% as the next phase.
Agreed.
We got another question here. This is a challenging one, so I think we're both going to be challenged a little, but look at your crystal ball a second. Any predictions of what's coming next?
Yeah, look, I think, from my perspective, I'm terrible at predictions because I just say, hey, all the things that we've seen in the past, we're just going to see more and more of. And I guess technically I tend to be right, but I'm just cheating because I'm just basically repeating what I've seen. But the reality is, look, I think for most organizations, the number one threat that we will continue to deal with is ransomware and multifaceted extortion. I mean, it's the number one way in which threat actors choose to monetize their intrusions. Gone are the days where threat actors want to steal credit card information or bank account details and try to sell it online. Yeah, they'll still steal that data, but they try to extort companies with that information as opposed to trying to sell a whole bunch of credit card numbers on underground markets and forums. So we'll definitely see a lot of that. We'll see a continuation of a variety of governments conducting intrusion operations. Typically for but for espionage purposes. And we will see more political focus attacks by a variety of governments. We've seen it already. I think we'll see even more of that. And then maybe the third thing that we didn't really talk about too much, but it's much less skilled, is the business email compromise types of attacks. That is a huge problem. It doesn't involve very sophisticated hacking. A lot of times it's just clever scams, but a lot of victims tend to lose money and substantial amounts of money because of that. And I think those are the three things that we'll just see a whole lot more of. And then maybe the fourth thing, and again, I'm kind of cheating a little bit because I've already seen this, but we'll see more kids continue hacking because they're getting a lot of fame and glory by doing this. And they're not hacking necessarily because they want money. Sure, everybody will take money and they're getting some money, but they're doing this a lot for fame and glory. They want to brag to their friends and say they've hacked into big technology company X or telecommunications company Y.
Yeah. Yeah, so on my crystal ball, it's showing similar things to yours, but definitely on the ransomware aspect, I mean, we think we can say with a high degree of confidence that's not going away anytime soon. I'll also say, as pertains to the Russia-Ukraine war, I do have somewhat of a pessimistic approach here. I think a lot of the fact we haven't seen the spill over to the Western countries is Russia is bogged down and they are in a challenging spot with where they're at. And obviously things have played out differently for them than what they originally anticipated. And I think they don't have that attention span and focus to be able to do some of the things that they'll probably do. And as time continues and we, things kind of flatten out in terms of the activity in the region, I think that some of this, and especially with economic stress they'll be under, some of this will start to spill over, I think, into Western countries. So I do think things will be coming our way, and they'll play out likely in the next several months. When, where exactly, who knows to say, but that's kind of what, the general direction I think things will lead. Well, Charles, this was an awesome discussion. Really enjoyed it. Every time talking to you, it's fruitful and insightful every time. I envy you for being able to see so much of these attacks in such a grand scale. Obviously, we'd all rather them not be there, but at least it's fascinating to understand it and see it and track it. Any parting thoughts from your side before we wrap up?
Yeah, look, well, first of all, I appreciate you inviting me to do this, and it's always great talking to you, Ofer. I try to, reiterate the kind of the two tactical things I think are helpful. Do the red teaming and do the tabletop exercises with your leaders. And then try to recognize that, this whole shields up effort, it's really important right now, but there are a lot of threats and they will persist for a long time. So we're dealing with a marathon, not a sprint. And so, treat your security teams well, don't overwork them, because this is going to be something that's going to continue for years, and it's the new normal. And so we have to continue to do things in a very, measured way that allows us to do this over the long term, as opposed to getting back to usual in 2 months or so, which the new usual, the new normal is going to be what we're dealing with today.
Absolutely. Charles, thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Stay safe.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.